Hi, welcome to the workshop organized by the Journal of International Aid Society, Publish or Perish, on how to write and submit a research manuscript. We're very excited to have you with us today. My name is Marlène. I'm the executive editor of the Journal of International Aid Society, and today I will facilitate this workshop with Dr. Anna Grimsrud, who is, among other things, one of the deputy editor of the Journal of International Aid Society. So let's start. Next slide, please. So the objectives of this workshop today are twofold. By the end of the session, we would like you to know more about how to write a research manuscript that is representative of your study. And we would like also you to understand the editorial process of an article publication, meaning what is happening between the moment you submit your manuscript and the moment your manuscript is being accepted. We also aim at giving you tips on how to make your reviewers and your editors happy. So this is what we are going to discuss today. Next slide, please. A few words about the journal before we start. The Journal of International Aid Society is an online peer-reviewed journal. It is a journal that is open access, so meaning that the content is freely accessible to all. And as you can see here, there are two very little covers on the slides. Those are two supplements that we've been publishing recently, and I encourage you to go on the website and to access and read them for free. The journal is multidisciplinary and provides a platform for the dissemination of essential HIV research. And we do also capacity building activities like the one we're doing with you today. Next slide, please. So, big question. Why should you publish? And why it is so important to publish? Well, think that publishing your research will advance both scientists and science. And in a way, from a scientific point of view, results that are not published mean the research did not take place. So you might have the most amazing results or some very great lesson learned that you would like to share. If no one knows about it, it won't be useful to the community. So that's really an important part, an important of basically any researcher's job. Next slide, please. So this is a workshop, so we're going to try to make you work a little bit and try to have the session a bit interactive. So you will see that we have few polls during this workshop where we're going to ask you to vote. And something that I forgot to mention is that at the end of the workshop, we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you have any question, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we will respond to you at the end of the workshop. So what makes a good manuscript, to your opinion? Is it A, an interesting topic, or B, a very large sample size, or C, a setting of interest, or D, a good scientific question? We're going to give you 30 seconds to vote, and then we're going to see what you think. Okay, so I think that you should have all voted by now, and you mostly said it's a good scientific question. Next slide, please. And I agree with you. Next slide. So something that is, well, probably obvious to you, but maybe good to repeat, is that a well-written manuscript cannot make up for a bad study. And really, a good study is based on asking the right question. It's really all about your question, your research question, because your research is based on a question you wanted to explore. And the same way, your entire manuscript will revolve around this question. So first, you're going to give some information to the readers. You're going to give background information, explain why your research is important, what is the question, an answered question that you were trying to address, and what's the context, what's the issue. So you're going to give all those background information, so it's very clear why your research is very important and needs to be done. Then you will explain how you design your study in order to answer to this very important question. You will then collect your data first, analyze your data, and you will then present them in the manuscript, and you will analyze those data. Then finally, you will compare them to the existing literature, compare how your findings are in light of what has been already published in similar settings, for example. And you will underscore how what you found has answered your research question and advanced the field. And then you will give away your conclusions in the last part. Next slide, please. So the structure of your manuscript depends very much on the type of manuscript you are writing. If you're writing a review, it's going to be different from a debate, from a research manuscript, or from a viewpoint, for example. Today, we will only look at research manuscripts, and you will see that each journal will have its own instructions. So it's very good to pick up a journal before you start writing. It will save you time. But in general, and this is what is highlighted on this slide, the general structure, which is quite well accepted, particularly in biomedical sciences, is called IMRAD, and it stands for Introduction, Methods, and Material, Results, and Discussion. However, as you can see, the manuscript has many other elements. There's the abstract, there are the figures, there are the references, so many other aspects besides those four core sections. So we will go through each section in turn, although you might write in a different order. Next slide. Okay, so where to start? Before you start, you need to have a good overview of your manuscript. So you need to really order your thoughts. And what I would recommend you to do is to answer these questions that are on the slide in very short sentences. Because if you cannot convey very clearly the key messages here, the risk is that you won't be clear in your manuscript either. So ask yourself, have I done something new and interesting? What problems did my study address, and how did my study address this? What are my key findings? What are the implications for research, practice, and policy? And once you have done this, when it's very clear in your head, well, you start writing your paper. Many people will start with the method section because it is really the easiest part to write, because you know how you conducted your study. And very often there are conventional sentences to describe this. So it's a bit, you don't need to be extremely creative in your method section. Then the authors usually go over to the results section because you decide there which information should be displayed in figures or tables, or should be included in the text, or in which figures or which results should not be there because they are not important for your paper. Next, usually you have the introduction section and then the discussion section. And often the discussion section is the hardest part to write because there are the least rules to guide you. The abstract and the title will depend on the author's preference. Some will decide to start with a preliminary version, and finalize it once the manuscript is ready. Others just wait when that everything is ready to start. Next slide, please. We're going to now have a little poll question, and I would like you to think about what, to your opinion, is the most important part of a manuscript. Do you think that A, it's the title, B, no, it's absolutely the abstract, C, the results section, obviously, or D, the methods? Again, you should have a poll question where you could vote, and we would really love to hear your votes. So I think that now we should have the results. So what did you think? Title, abstract, results, methods? Methods. No, B, sorry, the abstracts. Next slide, please. So I would say it is a title, and it might look surprising for you, But let's discuss that together. Next slide, please. So to my opinion, the title is maybe the most important part of your article. Why? Because I think that this is the part that is most often read and often the only part read. So your title has to be short, specific, representative, and informative. It will contain as well the keywords for search engines so that readers can find your paper. So whenever you're writing your title, try to think about how you would search for this piece of information. Sometimes the title will summarize the main finding of a conclusion. There are no rules against that, but try to think that declaratory titles are sometimes, sometimes they do not do justice to your research, so be careful with that. But really consider the title as a mini advertisement of your work. Next slide. So this is a title that we're going to read together. Uptake and impact of facility-based HIV self-testing on PrEP delivery, a pilot study among young women. So looking at this title, I would like you to think of the kind of information that is missing from this title. Is it response A that you should, next slide, sorry, please. Is it what, the where, the who, or the how? So again, we're going to give you 10 seconds to vote. And I'm just going to reread the title because you might actually not see it. The title that we had before was Uptake and Impact of Facility-Based HIV Self-Testing on PrEP Delivery, a Pilot Study Among Young Women. So A, B, C, or D. Next slide, please. So the response is B. Next slide. So let's look again this title. And as you can see here, we have added a part in this title. So uptake and impact of facility-based HIV self-testing on PrEP delivery. This is the what. We know what it is about. We know that it is a pilot study. It's a how, could be a bit more detailed, but it gives an indication. We know that this pilot study has been conducted among young women. So we know about the population study. What we didn't know was where the study took place. So this is something that we've been hiding here. And actually, the study took place in Kisumu, Kenya. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is an abstract? This is the next section, which is most often read and which is mostly freely available, accessible as well. So think that not all journals are open access, and sometimes the papers, the full paper will be behind a paywall, but the abstract will always be freely available to everybody. Think also that whenever you will decide on whether you want to read the full paper or not, what will help you make this decision is the title, but it's also the abstract. So your abstract needs to include all the important details and data from your research study, and it absolutely needs to serve as a standalone summary of your work. By reading your abstract, we should have all the important information. So although those headings that you can see here on the slide, the title, introduction, methods, results, conclusion, those headings might change depending on the journal, but it is usually almost always like that. If it's not called introduction, it's going to be called background, but the goal is the same. In this section, the introduction, you will describe the issue, the knowledge gap, and the aim of your study. In the methods, you will very briefly talk about the methodology you used or the approach you took. The results will present the main finding and data from your study, and the conclusion will summarize very briefly the main outcomes and discuss the implication and the recommendation. Very important, do not go beyond what is established in your paper Do not offer non-significant results in your abstract, and do not speculate. What we see sometimes is that abstracts we receive are either incomplete or they do not reflect the work and the rest of the main manuscript. Next slide, please. Okay, so during this entire workshop, we will use an article that has been published in August 2020 in JIAS by Venga and colleague. And the title of this paper we're using for the exercise is titled Uptake and Impact of Facility-Based HIV Self-Testing on PrEP Delivery, a Pilot Study Among Young Women in Kisumu, Kenya. So this title should be pretty familiar to you by now because it is a title we looked at just earlier. For the purpose of this workshop, we have been editing and work a little bit on the writing to make it simpler. So it would have been a very, very long article. But I really invite you to read the full version of this article on the journal's website. So let's look at some of the important elements that are mentioned in this abstract. We have the introduction, and we know that for the introduction we need the topic. So we have this information there. We know that HIV testing is a required part of delivery of pre-exposure prophylaxis. So this is the topic, HIV testing and PrEP for HIV prevention. However, we are being told repeat testing can be challenging in busy, understaffed clinical settings, which could negatively impact PrEP uptake and continuation. This is the issue there. Then the author tells us that they prospectively evaluated optional facility-based HIV self-testing among young women using PrEP in an implementation program. So this is the aim of this particular study. So we have quite a lot of information there. Now let's look at the method section. They tell us that between February and November 2019, we know the study period, they collected data from young women receiving PrEP at 2 family planning active facilities in Kisumu, Kenya. So this is a study setting. At each PrEP follow-up visit, women were given the option to choose between provider-initiated testing and HIV self-testing. Finally, what did they do? They assessed the factors associated with HIV self-testing uptake and compared satisfaction with HIV testing and clinic experience between acceptors and decliners of HIV self-testing. So that's a pretty informative method section. Next slide, please. Now let's have a look at the results section of this abstract. In this section, the authors will present their finding, and here you can clearly see that they list their main results in this section. They tell us that they have a total of 172 women who were offered HIV self-testing at 202 PrEP follow-up visits. They are telling, I'm not going to go in all the details of this section, but they also tell us the main results they got, meaning that what they saw is that compared to HIV self-testing decliner, HIV self-testing acceptors were more likely to be very happy with their overall testing experience, more likely to say they would use self-testing in the future. Women who accepted HIV self-testing at shorter visits than those choosing standard provider-initiated testing. So very thorough and very informative results. Now, if we look at the conclusion, the authors summarize the finding, but without necessarily repeating the result in detail, because they've done it already. And you know that an abstract, depending on the journal, it's 200, 350 words. So you want to use your word wisely, if I can say that. So you don't want to repeat exactly what you've been saying. So they're just summarizing their main results. And they tell us that in this pilot evaluation in Kenya, about 1/3 of women using PrEP opted for HIV self-testing over provider-initiated testing. And those choosing HIV self-testing spent less time in the clinic and were generally satisfied with their experience. So they're summarizing the main outcomes. What else are they telling us is that HIV self-testing in PrEP delivery is feasible and has the potential to simplify PrEP delivery and give client testing autonomy. And at the end, they give some recommendation about future research and future work to do. So here we have a very comprehensive abstract. When you read it, you understand the interest of the study. They want to examine how HIV self-testing can be used to optimize patient flow and visit efficiency, and that this is an important next step of HIV self-testing research. So they give you have basically a great standalone piece of information on the study, and based on that, usually if you're a reader, you can decide whether you want to read the full paper or not. So it's not as detailed as the old manuscript, but it already gives you all the information in a very condensed form. And again, remember, not journals are open access, but people will always read your title, always read your abstract. So you want them to be willing to pay to access the rest of your paper or to use your paper. So don't overlook the abstract. And now, next slide, please. So we talked about the title, we talked about the abstract. Anna will join us on stage and start digging a little bit into the subtleties of the rest of the research manuscript. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Marlène, and hello to everyone joining today. I can see some of you here close to me. I'm in South Africa. I can see some other South Africans joining, as well as others from Uganda, Nigeria, Malawi, etc. So thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to focus this next section of the workshop on how to write the research manuscript. So that would be all the pieces after the title and abstract that Marlène mentioned. So next slide. The introduction is the first piece where you really are going to describe and offer up some background to your research topic. And so there's some basic parts that are included in every abstract. We want to make sure that it provides the background. So what is the topic? We also want to make sure that it includes the context. So what do we know and what previous research has been done? It has the challenge or why we did this research or the gap. And then it really, really succinctly also tells the reader the question. So just like Marlène showed you that ice cream cone on an earlier slide, this introduction is also a funnel shape, from being very general to getting to the more specifics of your specific gap, your specific question, and why your research is so important. It's also going to depend the shape of your funnel a little bit on what sort of journal that you are submitting your paper to. So given that this is an HIV audience, if you were submitting a paper to a global health journal, you might provide some very general information about HIV, given that the readership includes people from outside of the HIV field. However, if you were submitting to an HIV journal, you might be able to dive in a little bit deeper from the beginning and assume that the readers know something about HIV in relation to your topic. So make sure that you ask a colleague about how to do that in terms of what sort of background is relevant for the audience of the journal that you're submitting to. Next slide. So as you've noticed from this workshop, we're digging into this one recently published paper in the journal. And here we are showing some background or an example of an introduction section. And this is from that HIV self-testing and PrEP pilot study. And so this is an example of the introduction. So we're going to read it together and see what is missing. So just remember, we're looking to make sure there's the background, the context, the challenge, and the question. So I'm just going to read this really quickly. Feel free to follow along with me. As the scale of PrEP increases globally, barriers to implementation still remain. At a health system level, a significant barrier is the complexity of PrEP delivery due to the required regular HIV testing and monitoring in PrEP users. Integrating PrEP into routine primary care settings is feasible and can facilitate reaching potential PrEP candidates, promote patient-centered care, and destigmatize PrEP. However, PrEP can add a burden on health systems, necessitating investigation of ways to simplify PrEP delivery. Several studies in sub-Saharan Africa have shown high acceptability, uptake, and accurate use of HIV self-testing in men and women. Nevertheless, most studies of HIV self-testing have only evaluated it for screening, and to date, no study has evaluated the integration of facility-based HIV self-testing in PrEP delivery and its use as a tool to optimize patient flow and visit efficiency. HIV testing is necessary before starting or restarting PrEP, and at least every 3 months during PrEP use. Some guidelines additionally recommend testing 1 month after starting PrEP. In busy and understaffed clinics, this volume of testing could create inefficiencies and negatively impact prep programs, including reducing numbers willing to start or continue on prep due to long wait times and provider willingness to prescribe prep. Therefore, incorporating strategies to streamline retesting may help reduce staff time and associated costs, and therefore improve prep delivery efficiency. So poll question 4 is going to go up now in relation to this introduction and ask which element is missing from this introduction. So next slide. Is there background provided in that introduction? Was the context provided? Was the challenge provided? And was there a question provided? I'm going to give you all a few moments to vote and answer our poll question here. So what was missing from that introduction that I read through very, very quickly? So go ahead and vote. I'm just going to wait till I see the results and we can go to next slide. Thank you to those of you who voted. You were unanimously correct that the question or the aim was missing. Next slide. And so you'll see really sneakily what we did here is we removed the part of the introduction that was the question. So I read out the background, the context, and the challenge paragraph. And if you go next slide, you'll be able to see that we removed this important note, which was the question or the aim of the study, which was that they conducted an evaluation of facility-based HIV self-testing aimed to streamline PrEP delivery. And something that's going to become a recurring theme as we go through this part of the workshop is that for research manuscripts, they're very formulaic in how they're written. And so this is a really useful template that you can remind yourself of when writing an introduction. The first paragraph should be background, the next context, the next challenge, and then next the question. And it's really important to include these components within the introduction. Also, from my experience, I would say that an introduction is something that can be written first when you're preparing your manuscript. So even while your study is ongoing, you should still be able to draft the introduction because you know the background, the context, the challenge, and the question, and therefore the reason why you did the research. So the introduction is something you can do at the beginning, whereas I would say the abstract is the last thing you want to do. So I'll speak to that a little bit more in terms of ordering of writing your manuscript. Next slide. So following the introduction is the methods, right? And this is obviously how did you answer your study question? What was the method or what was the recipe you used to create your study? This is incredibly important to be very specific here because the emphasis should be on whether or not it's reproducible. So someone else should be able to read the method study of your manuscript and repeat the study if they wanted to. We want to make sure the methods are comprehensive enough that someone else could repeat it, like I said, but focus on the components that drove your study results. And so if you are struggling with the word count, you want to make sure that you have that focus on the key findings or what led to the key findings. Findings are obviously going to come in the results section. The methods should also be relevant, concise, and use past tense. As this was something you had completed already, you did this study. And I think that's a very important point here, is to highlight both the methods and the results sections are things that have happened, so past tense when you write your paper. And you may need to also be able to provide additional material on request. So this might be that you need to be able to show the ethics approval letter, or you need to show the study design and the protocol approval. So just make sure that you know that. Bolded on this slide as well, which I'll just read out to you, is no results yet. So don't tell them what happened, tell them what you did. And therefore, again, similar to the introduction section, you can write your methods section while your study is ongoing because you are already using that formula at that time. Next slide. When you are writing your methods section, the formula to think of is the 4 W's plus how. So make sure you describe who the study was about, how you did it, where it took place, what happened, and when it happened. And again, here we've got the scales at the bottom of the slide to say you're going to have to find a balance between providing a lot of detail and the word limit with the journal submission, all right? And something that can be really helpful to the reader is to include some subheadings in the methods. So you may include subheadings such as analysis, for example, or variable definition, things that help make it very easy to the reader to find specific components of your work. So again, you can write the introduction while your study's ongoing and also the methods section. And to Marlène's earlier point, a strong manuscript and a strong publication are obviously when we're able to fill a gap with the work that's being done. So we want to make sure that you write the methods section and it's a really strong summary of what you did. Next is the results section. And the results, you can hit next slide, as you all know, is what happened. What did you find? The formula for the results section really starts with presenting the key findings of your study, right? So this is not every single data point. It's the key things, the most important things, the headline messages. And this is where you also want to make sure that you are presenting the data that came from your study. So what are the data or the numbers that you're looking at to answer your question? This could include dates, it could include absolute or relative numbers, it could include proportions or confidence intervals. And it's also going to be where you present the statistical analyses that you undertook. It's also where you're going to link to a number of inserts. So inserts being tables and figures. And we're going to talk a little bit about tables and figures further on, but just to make the note that not everything that's in a table and figure you also need to repeat directly in the text, but rather you can highlight some of the key things and refer people to these tables and figures. It's also, the results are where you don't place a value judgment. So you really say what you found, not if it was super interesting or really exciting. You are trying to present it as an unbiased summary of what you found. And so you're not going to use things like, this is really interesting or no one else has found this. You're just going to say, this is what we found. Okay, and we've got some notes at the bottom here just to say, don't discuss, as I mentioned, and also don't repeat the methods. So this is very simply just what the results were, just what you found. Next. This is that same paper that I'm hopeful that you're all going to go look at after the workshop today. But just to say that here you can see in 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.3 is just to highlight that there are some categories that are traditionally used within a results section, again, to help break up the text and guide the reader. So in the HIV self-testing study at facilities related to PrEP use, you can see that they describe the patient characteristics, the uptake of HIV self-testing, the experience and satisfaction with the testing, and then the experience and satisfaction of the clinic. And so this is a really useful way, instead of having paragraph after paragraph, to highlight for the reader where they can find specific results. Next slide, setting you up for another poll. So here I've shown only the first part of the results section of this manuscript, and I'm going to just read it a little bit for you and see if you can highlight something that has been, isn't done the best that it could be. And this is not a reflection of the true publication. We've played with the language a little bit, so please don't think that this is any critique of the author's work. So overall, more than 200 women contributed, almost 400 PrEP follow-up visits in the study, a few visits during the standard of care period, and the majority in the HIV self-testing period, with a maximum of 3 observations per person. A third of the women had at least 1 visit, a few had two visits, and some had more than 2 visits. Although those enrolled in the pilot, among those enrolled in the pilot, most of the women were young, most had never married, and only had 1 partner and had completed up to secondary school. At the enrollment, most women had also reported they'd never used HIV self-testing. And so I want you to think here, what is wrong with this results section in your opinion? And that's the question for the poll on the next page. So what's wrong? Are the results is it that the results are being discussed? Is it that the data are not specific enough, or is it nothing? This is perfect. What do you guys think of that results section that I just paraphrased for all of you? Just going to give you a few seconds and see what you guys thought of that results section. Excellent. So the vast majority of you selected B, and you can see that I would agree with you if you go to the next slide, that the data really are not specific enough. And so if you go to the next slide, highlighted in red here are all the places where we took out and changed information. So if you go to next, you'll see that it's not okay to say some women contributed like 300 or so visits. You want to be really specific. So we've noted the exact number of women, the exact number of visits, the exact proportion of women that had one visit, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really important that there's a high degree of specificity within the results section, that you're saying dates, you're stating numbers, you're stating percentages, and you're looking as well at confidence intervals and other analyses that you've conducted that are the result of your work. So you really want to make sure that your results section, if it's quantitative research, has exact numbers and figures in it. Moving on now briefly to tables and figures. These are somewhat subjective, I would say. So everyone has a little bit of their own opinion on tables and figures and what works best and what looks best, but there are some general really important rules to follow. The first is that most journals only have a limit on the number of tables and figures. And so you want to select the most important things to communicate to be in a table or figure. You should be able to understand a table and figure without reading the results section, so they should be standalone. And that means that they have really good titles, really good labels. You also want to make sure that you choose a table or figure based on the type of data. So some will be better as a figure and some will be better as a table. You don't, again, want them to overlap with the text entirely. And you really want to be careful with colors. So make sure you talk this through with some of your colleagues. Make sure that you know that it will look good. It will work when it's printed in black and white, and that it will work for people who have issues with color blindness. So you see a couple figures on the slide here, and I would argue that the figure on the left with these the blue and the green and the red would actually be really hard to read if it was black and white. So make sure you print out your figures and see if they work if they're in black and white. Next slide. Near the end of your paper, so maybe not at the exact end, is the discussion section. And this discussion section is really where, again, you reflect on the findings of your study and you put them into context. And this is probably the most difficult part. And so this is something I would save for last. Your intro, your methods, your results, those are quite straightforward, whereas the discussion is often the part that takes the most time. So in a discussion, it's also very formulaic. You describe your main findings, and then you put them in context with other studies, other regions, other data that's available. This is also where you convey to the reader the challenges you had in the implementation of your research and what kind of lessons learned you have if someone else was going to do similar work. You also talk about the generalizability of your findings. So is this something that you think is relevant to everyone who is a PrEP provider, or is it only relevant to Kisumu, Kenya, for example? And then additionally, you also talk about the implications. And this means implications for policymakers, implementations for implementers, and implementations for future research. And all of these are a critical component, a way of kind of a paragraph at the end of your discussion. Next slide. So while you don't repeat your results, this needs to be based on your results. So your discussion needs to reflect what your study actually found. Also, a really critical component and something that I always look for when I'm reviewing papers is what the authors say their strengths and limitations are of their research. So regardless of how good your study was, there are still limitations, and these should be explicitly stated. And so this is an important part, and it doesn't mean that you did poor research. We all have strengths and limitations, and it's important to be explicit about those. You also want to make sure that you are citing key references to put it into context, and that this is the one place where a degree of speculation is acceptable. So if you, based on the results of your study, have a hypothesis as to why that happened, this is where you could posit that speculation. And it's obviously going to be more impactful if you have the data to back it up. And again, just to restate that last paragraph is going to be the limitations section, but you don't want anything that isn't based on the data from your study. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see an edited version of the discussion from the paper that we've been using for this workshop. I'm not going to read it in detail, but I want to draw your attention to some of the parts that are highlighted and bolded here to show you how the authors place their findings in context. So first of all, they said in this pilot study, and they gave the headline findings. They also, in the next paragraph, talked about how it was consistent with other studies. And so you will see this quite often, that people will say consistent with other studies or in conflict with other work, and then talk about why maybe the findings were different than other similar research. Again, very explicitly, you'll see the third paragraph here. This was a pilot evaluation and it has important limitations. And importantly, right, this is a published paper. So published papers have limitations, and that's okay. You need to describe them well. And then the final paragraph is that our study provides important evidence, and it's the first study to investigate. So it's also making a call for further research. Next slide. Some manuscripts also have a conclusion section on its own, or the conclusions is the last section of the discussion. And in the conclusion section, this is really where you summarize the key take-home message, make a statement about the wider implication of your findings, make some recommendations, and discuss future research. But you want to, wherever possible, avoid these obvious statements, avoid repeating the results, and avoid being overgeneralizing. So your research is probably not going to solve all the world's problems. So make sure in your conclusion section, you really stick to what you think was really additive about the work that you've done. Okay, final poll from my side on the next slide. So here we want to know, is this a good conclusion section? And I'm just going to read it out loud for you, and you're going to get asked yes or no. This pilot evaluation of HIV self-testing in the context of PrEP shows that facility-based HIV self-testing in PrEP delivery is feasible and can reduce visit times. More studies are needed to understand how HIV self-testing could be used not only to screen for HIV, but also as a tool to streamline PrEP delivery, promote PrEP persistence, and offer the flexibility for PrEP users to have testing options during their PrEP visits. So, do you think, next slide, this is a good conclusion section or no? And while I'm waiting for your results to come in, I'm just going to invite Marlène back onto stage to join me for the baton passover for the last section of this workshop. All right, so do you guys think this is a good conclusion section? Yes or no? Ooh, we've got 2/3 saying yes and 1/3 saying no. So next slide. Next slide. We've said it is a good conclusion section, and we'll highlight why on slide 43 here, which is that it does present the main study findings without going on and on about it. And it also does make some recommendations for what future work would be additive to making this important for policy and practice. All right, Marlène, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anna. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've done part one, which was talking about how to write research manuscript that is representative of your study. And thanks to Anna and to the first part, you know exactly how to write your paper. Now, what is going to happen when you write your paper? You're going to submit to a journal, and you're going to want to have your paper published. So we're going to go to part 2 now, which is understanding the editorial process of an article publication. Next slide, please. So, and we're going to start with another poll question. And to your opinion, which section of a manuscript usually contains the most errors? And we're going to give you a couple of seconds to vote. You should have a poll. Do you think that, next slide, please. Do you think that A, it's the references, B, the introduction, C, the figures, or D, the methods? I see that we have 62 participants in this workshop. I really hope to see 62 answers, and I'm sure I'm going to have 62 right answers. So I'm just, oh, okay, the results are actually already on the slide. So yeah, it is actually the references. Next slide. So it might look a bit odd, and you're like, oh, why the references? And why should we bother so much about the references? Well, the references is often an overlooked section, but it is a very important section of your manuscript because, for example, if you just provide data from others without properly referencing them, this is plagiarism, and this is a reason to have your manuscript being rejected. The section will show your knowledge and awareness of the field. So what you should do is avoid citation bias. For example, you're only going to cite your own papers, or you're going to ignore completely the papers that do have very different findings than your finding. You can't do that deliberately, ignoring other papers. So this section will really validate your claims and your arguments. So don't forget to look at the references style of each journal, because each journal has different rules. For example, for our JIAS, we use the Vancouver style, and also try to read your sources. Another tip that I can give you is that we see when an article has not been referenced according to our own journal's guidelines because references are not correct, and this gives us the information that either the paper has been rejected from another journal or that really we were not clearly the first target for this paper. So try to make the effort. It's normal in the life of a paper that you submit somewhere, you get rejected, and that's sometimes a bit annoying because you need to reformat the old paper, but really it is important to do it. Next slide. There are other sections, obviously, where there are common errors. One of it is the acknowledgement and funding source. And please think that you are responsible for getting written permission for the people that are mentioned here. And you should also comply with your funder's regulation about acknowledging their support. Usually they give you very clear guidance on how they should be acknowledged in the manuscript. The other part where we can see sometimes a lot of error is the author's contribution. And that is something that I would recommend being very careful about. And if I had a recommendation to you, it would be to actually start deciding on who will be an author of a paper before you start writing the paper. Be very clear and make sure that all the co-authors are in agreement to know, what will be the order of the authors. Now the journals routinely ask the different contributions, so who did what, and it's very important because you need to take responsibility for certain part of a study. So we strongly discourage having honorary or ghost authors. Sometimes you might get hierarchical pressure to have someone in the paper who did not contribute meaningfully in the manuscript, but you should really look into that. The last part is often the conflict of interest, and it's very important for transparency reasons that you mention all conflict of interest, whether they are professional, financial, personal, or only potential conflict of interest. And you might think that personally there's no conflict of interest and that nothing has been influencing your interpretation of the data, but it is actually not up to you to decide that. So just be very transparent. Next slide, please. Okay, how to choose journal, how to decide which journal you're going to take. Next slide. So what will be the different factors? Is it going to be how it is indexed, and should have the poll being shown at the moment? Is it B, because it's open access, C, it's because of a publication fee, D, the journal impact factor, E, the speed of editorial decision, F, the primary audience, G, the scope, of H, all of those. Just giving you 2 seconds because we're arriving at the end of the session. So we try to go through the entire session. Next slide. So it could be all of those different criteria here. So all those responses are valid, and it's something you should really think about, because choosing the wrong journal will result in rejection, and this can be very, very frustrating. Next slide. Okay, what to do and not to do in manuscript submission. Next slide. The first is read the instruction. Every journal has its own set of instruction with very detailed information. Go on the web page, examine a recent issue of a journal. Also, in that way, you can see if there are papers that are published that are a bit similar to what you would like to publish. So it gives you an indication that this is the right journal for your kind of research. So have a look, read a recent issue, keep a recent issue, a recent paper with you while you're writing. And there are some resources to help you as well that are mentioned on this slide. Next slide, please. What are the most often ignored instructions that we can see? It's the word count and incorrect formatting, the table and figures, the poor quality of figures or the photo or abbreviation that are not spelled out or clearly explained in the text. Next slide. So most journals will do a pre-assessment of a manuscript before deciding whether they will send them to peer review or not. It's an important step to avoid wasting people's time, your time as an author, but also the reviewer's time and the editor's time. So they do check whether the manuscript fit within the scope of a journal. We do check if the objectives are clear, if the results are important. We also do check whether the study contributes something novel, if the study design and the methodology are valid, and if the presentation is of good quality in general. Next slide. So what is happening when your paper has been sent to reviewers and you are getting the comments of the reviewers? So sometimes this can be sort of a difficult situation because, well, you have people critiquing your work, and it's never pleasant to have people, it's never pleasant to be confronted to critical comments and major requests of revision. But I encourage you to go at it systematically and to respond to every comment, do point by point response. Comply with as many requests as possible. If you disagree, which is also completely fine, you should explain the reason for non-compliance very politely and logically. As I was saying, you don't need necessarily to comply with all the comments, but you have to address them. So make sure that you are concise, that you are measured while you're responding. Don't go with an argumentative tone. Do not question the credential of a reviewers or dismiss their opinion or argue that the strength of the other aspect of the manuscript outweighed the weaknesses that have been identified by the reviewers. Really try to use the comment constructively and revise your manuscript carefully, because it is really to help and to make your manuscript better. Next slide. Few practical hints to make your editor happy. Try to copy-paste the reviewer's comments in the order that they are provided. Number them if necessary. Try to distinguish between the comments of your reviewer and your own answer. You can put that in color, in bold, in italic. Detail exactly what has been changed. Do not say, oh, this has been corrected, because then your editor will have to go in a treasure hunt, and it can be very time consuming for everybody as well. So use track changes if your edits are too extensive, and I highlight the section that you've been changing in the manuscript. Next slide. The 7 scenes in publication that I would like to flag with you very, very quickly is something you should be very conscious about and be careful with is carelessness, like citation bias, that we discussed before. Plagiarism, if you copy-paste the work of others without references. Redundancy is, for example, if you are doing self-plagiarism with your own work. Unfair authorship, which is having guests or ghost author who didn't do anything significant in the paper. Undeclared competing interests, subject violation, obviously, which is extremely bad, and fraud, which is whenever we see overnight Photoshop data. So next slide, please. There are a few resources that can help you there, and this will be made available after, so we encourage you to go over there. Next slide. We're going to have a few minutes to talk about the question. Next slide. But before that, I would like to thank the JIAS Educational Fund Publishing workshop, just to tell you that the workshop has been made available thanks to a grant from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Next slide. And in the chat, you should have at the moment a survey, not a poll. You had enough polls, but a survey to evaluate the workshop. Please, please, please do fill out the evaluation form. It's really important for us to know what we did well, what we could improve, how it went for you. It will help us. It will help the donor, and it will help us get better next time. I'm going to invite Anna to join, and we have really few minutes to answer any question you may have. But otherwise, if you have burning questions, please do not hesitate to contact the editorial office, and you should have in the chat the email address.
So I just want to address one of the questions that's been shared with us on stage from you all attendees, which was a question about whether or not, how do you know what is interesting? So you might think something is interesting, but maybe someone else doesn't. And a little bit to some of the points that Marlène highlighted in the beginning would be that a really good paper can't solve the fact if the research isn't interesting. So hopefully you're able to discern whether or not the research question is interesting and there is a real gap in advance of doing your work. And so I think that is part of being, that is aided by having a strong group of collaborators that you work with to make sure that there is a gap in the research and that your study is designed to fill that gap. So that's how I would make sure that you are producing work of interest.
If I could just add to that, it is also what might be interesting for one journal might not be interesting for another journal. That's why it's important to always go and look at what is being published to make sure that you increase your chances to get published by targeting the appropriate audience and therefore targeting the appropriate journal.
Absolutely. We also have another question here about whether or not we will be able to provide you with this presentation material. And my understanding is that it will be made available. Otherwise, you're all welcome to go to the journal website and follow up with some of the email addresses that you'll find on there if you're unable to find it through interest. But I'm quite confident you're getting it through the interest workshop.
We have another question, Anna, on what would be a rule of thumb to be offered. It's a complicated question. There's some guidance to help you there, some recommendation, the ICMGE, that define what is meaningful contribution. But clearly, you should make sure that there's a distinction that should be made between people you're going to acknowledge and you're going to thank because they've been helping in a way, and people who will actually contribute massive, important parts of the work. Anna, do you want to add anything?
My only addition would be to restate what Marlène said during the workshop, which was that if possible, you should identify upfront and in advance who is going to be part of the author team. And many journals these days, including the Journal of the International AIDS Society, want you to describe the role that each person had in the research and in the preparation of the manuscript. So you are going to have to make sure that you have a meaningful contribution in order to be listed as an author. So it's an awkward conversation, but one that should be had as soon as possible, rather than leaving it till the end.
Yeah, before you start writing. This is my recommendation. Agree before you start writing. Well, I think we are almost done. Again, I would like to thank you for your participation in this workshop today. We've been 62 attendees, so it's really, really nice. JIAS organize few workshops like that, so stay tuned if you want to participate in another workshop, maybe in a different language. And again, please do fill in the survey. And that's it. I wish you a wonderful day to all and a very good interest conference.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye everyone.